Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my fellow students. How are you today? All feeling well? Spirits are up? That's the spirit. Now, in our previous lecture, we concluded discussion on monopolistic competition. And now we just have one more type of market structure to talk about, that is oligopoly. Once we've discussed all these different types of market structures, you would better understand how any particular firm that you see around us operates in a particular market or in a particular economy, given the constraints of the market structure that it operates in. Now, before I move on to discuss oligopoly, I want to just talk about two features of monopolistic competition which will help us understand oligopolistic structures a little bit better. The first is that in monopolistic competition, you had a large number of firms producing differentiated products, but that they were not dependent on each other. They were independent of each other. When a particular firm made a decision about what to produce or how to produce or at what price to produce, at least in the short run, the other firms were not dependent or related to that decision. So this firm could take its decision in isolation, and we could study the implications for this firm's decision, for its profits, for its output, for its revenue, for its costs, right? Because we did not have to know about how other firms would respond to this firm's decision about price and output. This assumption of independence breaks down when we talk about oligopoly. In an oligopolistic structure, you have firms which are interdependent, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. The second point is that in monopolistic competition structures, you have non-price competition. I concluded the previous lecture with a discussion of advertising. Now, advertising is a type of non-price competition. The different firms are not competing on price. They are not trying to charge different prices and trying to attract customers based on those different prices. What they are trying to do is to attract customers who pay the same price for those different firms, but they are trying to build brand loyalty. And they do it through non-price competition, that is, through putting in advertising dollars. Those are the two things that you should keep at the back of your minds, because these will become very important in our discussion of oligopoly. Now, what are the defining characteristics of an oligopoly? Now, remember that in perfect competition, there were a large number of firms which were independent, which were price takers. In monopoly, there was just one firm which was a price maker. In monopolistic competition, there were a large number of firms producing differentiated products, but which were still independent. Now, oligopolies are very interesting and also very different. They're interesting because they share the features of the other three types of market structures that we have studied. So they resemble the other types in certain ways, but they are also different from all those three types in two or three fundamental ways. Let's see how oligopolies resemble the other market structures that we have so far studied. In an oligopolistic market structure, you usually have between 2 to 20 firms, right? Not more than 20. So if you have a small number of firms, that in a way resembles monopoly, where you just have one firm. So in that sense, in terms of the number of firms that are operating, an oligopoly resembles a monopoly. Also, because the number of firms is small, it suggests that there are certain barriers to entry. That is, not all the firms who want to enter the industry can enter. So there are certain fixed costs or economies of scale or some other factors which are deterring the entry of other firms, which is why the number of firms in an oligopoly remains not more than 20. So in those two ways, an oligopoly represents a monopoly. Now, in what way does an oligopoly represent perfect competition? Very interesting question. Because in perfect competition, you have a very large number of firms? Well, the key manner in which an oligopoly can resemble perfect competition is that if the 5 or 20 producers or firms in an oligopoly decide to not cooperate with each other, that is, if they decide to compete with each other, and we'll discuss this issue of cooperation in a little while, if they decide to compete against each other, the competition can become very fierce indeed. And it can become so fierce that the firms could actually be charging prices which could be as low as would be charged if the firms were perfectly competitive. So in that sense, in the sense that competition can become really tough and really harsh in oligopolies, they resemble perfect competition. Now, how do they resemble monopolistically competitive firms? Well, if you remember, in monopolistically competitive structures, you have firms producing differentiated products. That is, products that are slightly different from what the other firm is producing. And this assumption can also be applied to oligopoly. In oligopolies as well, you can allow for a situation in which those 5 to 20 firms are selling differentiated products. And I can give you the example of the car industry, in which you can have similar but slightly different cars being produced by different manufacturers. So you can have a 2000 cc car which will be produced by 2 or 3 or 4 manufacturers. They will be slightly different, but they will all be 2000 cc cars. Similarly, 800 cc cars or 1000 cc cars or motorbikes. So there will be a few manufacturers producing the same type of good, but there will be brand differences. So there will be differentiated products to that extent. However, it is also possible to have oligopolistic structures with undifferentiated products. So you can have oligopolies in, like, say, products like petroleum, which is oil. तेल की मार्केट जो है वो एक ओलिगोपोली की बड़ी अच्छी मिसाल है. इसके अलावा जो आप सीमेंट वगैरह और केमिकल्स, these also fall in the category of oligopolistic structures because they are usually between 5 to 10 or 20 producers, not more than that. So these are some of the examples of oligopoly, and these are the ways in which they resemble perfectly competitive or monopolistic or monopolistically competitive market structures. But there are two very important ways in which an oligopoly differs from all of these three structures. And the reason why I have discussed oligopoly at the end is because of these two differences. The first difference is that any oligopoly, any firm operating in an oligopoly is dependent upon the reaction or action of the other firms operating in the same market. So if a particular firm does something, then the other firm can respond to that, and that will affect this particular firm. And this gives rise to the second difference, and that is that it is not possible to identify any single equilibrium in an oligopoly. The theory of the firm under an oligopoly is not as well established or as clearly established as it is for a monopoly or for perfect competition or for monopolistically competitive firms. And the reason for that is that firms are interdependent. They are strategically interacting with each other. If I do something, before I do it, I will think about how the other firm will be responding to that. And that anticipated response of the other firm will affect the decision that I take today. So keep this in your mind, and with that, we will now be able to discuss how collusive and non-collusive or non-cooperative oligopolies exist in the real world. Now, before I can explain to you what collusive and non-collusive oligopolies are, I need to explain to you the term collusion. What does collusion mean? Collusion means when two or more firms or two or more individuals decide to cooperate or plot together. So they are planning, they are doing all their planning and plotting together. They sit inside a room and chalk out their future plans together. And you can immediately see why collusion is a possibility with oligopoly or oligopolistic firms because they are so few in number. Because there are 5 or 10 or 15 firms, they can all sit around a table and discuss their production strategies, their pricing strategies, and devise a common policy. Now, the incentive to do that is obvious. Why would 5 or 6 producers get together in a room and try to collude or try to encourage collusion? Why would they do that? They would do that because if they can combine their intelligences together, if they can come up with a unified plan and unified pricing and production plan, then they can charge higher prices. They can behave as if they are a monopoly. And if you are a monopoly, if you are a single producer in the market, then you can, as you know, charge very high prices and make supernormal profits. So the incentive for oligopolies to behave like monopolies is very strong. And they can behave like monopolies only if they collude with each other. That is, they cooperate with each other. So that's what collusion is. That is when oligopolists sit together and act like a monopoly and try to maximize the industry's overall profits. That is, their combined profits. But at the same time, because these oligopolistic firms are separate identities, that is, there are separate firms, they have in their own right the desire to maximize their own profits. So, at the same time, while they have the incentive to act like one and maximize industry profits, they have the desire or the wish to maximize their individual profits as well. Because each firm is an individual firm. They might behave like a single firm, but in their individual right, they are all individual firms. And these two opposing tendencies create tension. So on the one hand, they want to collude so as to maximize the industry profits, but they have the incentive to compete very strongly with each other because they want to maximize their share of the total industry profits. And this tension between collusion and competition gives rise to two possible scenarios that the oligopolistic structure can have. One which is called collusive oligopoly or a cartel structure, and the other one which is called non-collusive oligopoly, and we will come to that later on. Let's start our discussion with a collusive oligopoly which is called a cartel structure. Now, what happens in a collusive oligopoly? What happens is that firms sit together and they decide on what their respective market shares will be. So, if there are 5 firms, A, B, C, D, E, they'll sit around the table, they'll say the optimal quantity that will maximize the industry profits, that is the quantity at which our monopoly profits will be maximized, is, let's say, 100. And so we need to divide this 100 quantity between ourselves. If all the firms are identically sized, that is, they are of the same size, then the 5 firms will divide 20, 20, 20, 20, 20 units between themselves. So they will decide on market structures. Another way in which collusive oligopolies can cooperate is that they can decide on the advertising expenditures that they will put in. So each firm says that you will not put in more than 2 advertisements on the television, and each advertisement will be 30 seconds. And then all the firms decide how much advertising expenditures they need to put in. The third way in which they can cooperate is that they can set prices, right? So they'll agree on the prices that they will charge. Sometimes the prices can be identical, but sometimes because of differentiation in products, they can charge slightly different prices. Another way in which collusive oligopolies can operate is that they can decide on production quotas, right? So they say the total output will be 500, and if the firms are not equi-sized, that is, if the firms are not of equal size, I gave the example of when the firms were of equal size and when market share allocation was not a problem. But if the firms are not equi-sized, then quotas are allocated according to the marginal cost of each firm. Now, this is a complicated point. Let me elaborate it a little further. Now, consider when the industry as a whole, because a cartel operates like a monopoly and a monopoly is the industry, then consider when the industry profits will be maximized. The industry profits will be maximized when the costs of the firm, of the industry are minimized. And when would the costs of the firm or the monopoly minimized? The costs of the monopoly or the cartel will be minimized when the marginal cost of each of the firms in the cartel is equal. So consider a cartel in which firm A's marginal cost of producing an additional unit is $5, whereas firm's B is $6. So which firm should produce more? You will not stop at this level. You will ask the first firm to produce more and ask the second firm to produce less until their marginal costs become same, let's say at $5.5. Because if they are not same, then it makes sense to switch production from the less efficient firm or the less cost efficient firm to the more cost efficient firm. Now, the obvious problem or difficulty with this quota allocation methodology or mechanism is that firms which have higher marginal costs will get lower quotas because they will be asked to cut down on their production, whereas firms which have lower marginal costs will be asked to produce more. And therefore, if there are 10 firms and some of them have higher costs and some of them have lower costs, then the lower cost firms will suffer. They will be able to produce only a small quantity and therefore get a smaller pie of the cake, a smaller share of the pie. So in this situation, sometimes the marginal cost rule breaks down. And another rule is often followed, which is that cartels use existing market shares as the share in which future quantities will be produced. So that if existing firms are producing, let's say one firm is producing 5% of the total output, the other firm is producing 40% of the total output, and the last firm is producing, let's say, 55% of the total output, and there are just 3 firms, then they will agree to retain those market shares going into the future. That is, they will not talk about costs. They will just say that you've produced 5% in the past, so you will continue to produce 5% of whatever future quantity we decide on in the future. So once they agree on the quota, they allocate that quota based on historical market share. And this is one of the more popular ways in which quota allocation is done for cartels. Now, one important question to address here is that what are the situations in which collusion is more likely, or when does collusion happen? Are there certain conditions which make collusion more likely than other situations? Let's try to answer this question. Now, there are indeed quite a few factors which determine whether a number of firms will get together and form a collusive oligopoly, or what we call a cartel. What are those factors? Think about it. If the number of firms is small, that is, if you have 4 or 5 firms or 2 or 3 firms, it is more likely that they will be able to get together, sit around a table and agree on something or some strategy, some pricing or output strategy. If the number of firms is, let's say, 20, 25, then it will become progressively more difficult for them to first of all come together around a table and then also to agree. A second point that would cause firms to come together would be if they are not secretive about their production methods, about their costs, about their strategies. If they are very secretive about how they want to plan their production, which markets they are targeting, then it's unlikely that they will share that information with others and come to a conclusion which maximizes industry-wide profits. So that's another point. First, the number of firms that are in the market. Second, how secretive they are about their production processes. The third point is that if their production processes are similar and if the products that they produce are similar, then it's easier to draft agreements around those similar products. For example, if certain firms are producing differentiated products, other firms are producing some other kinds of products, then it's difficult for them to sit around a table and agree on the price and quantity strategies because the underlying products are different. So that's another factor. Similarly, if there is a dominant firm in the industry, if there is a price leader that is dominating the firm, which sets the price and the other firms take the cue from that, then that also helps the chances of a collusive oligopoly forming. What do I mean by a price leader or a dominant firm? Is that if, for example, there are 5 firms in the industry and one firm is a larger firm, it's the largest firm, let's say it accounts for 50% of the total output of the industry, then that firm can set a price and the other 4 or 5 firms can follow the lead from the price that has been set by the dominant firm. So the existence of a price leader helps the chances of a collusive oligopoly being formed. Also, if the market is stable, if the environment in which firms are operating is stable, that increases the chances of collusive oligopolies. Why? Because if the market is stable, then they don't have to change their agreements, their pricing and quantity strategies every now and then. If they agree on a certain price, then that price can remain optimal for a long period of time. However, if circumstances are changing on a daily basis, if it's a very dynamic market, if things change very fast, then they will need to sit again and again every next day or every next week to decide on a new pricing strategy. Especially if you think of a market which is a declining market, that is, the industry is shrinking over time, then you can imagine that individual firms might try to undercut other firms on price in order to maintain their sales revenue. Because each of the firms wants to sell the maximum possible output that it can. And if the overall market is declining, then in a rush to try to safeguard their sales levels, they might set prices which are lower than the other firms are charging. So that would lead to a breakdown of the oligopoly, the collusive oligopoly. Finally, and very importantly, the chances of a collusive oligopoly depend on how strict the government is in its antitrust laws. That is, how strict the government is on this issue of collusion, whether a particular government allows firms to collude with each other, either explicitly or implicitly or tacitly. And different countries have different legislations or laws on this. The UK, for example, does not allow collusive oligopolies to exist. They do not allow firms to collude with one another. However, some other governments do have strict laws, but their implementation is lax. It's not as strict. And so, de facto, firms can still collude with one another and achieve results which are analogous to a monopoly or a cartel. So the government stance on whether collusion is permitted or not is also an important determinant of whether a cartel can be successfully formed or not. Now, there are 2 important points that I want to make at this stage. One is that whenever a government, an individual government, passes a law banning collusion or collusive oligopolies, then the application of that law is only within the jurisdiction of that country. So it can't apply to a firm outside that country. So immediately you can see that cartels or collusive oligopolies, which are international in nature, that is, which have as their members different firms from different countries, are more likely to be successful because at least they will not be subject to any one country's laws against collusive oligopoly. So this is why the world's most famous cartel, the OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, operated very successfully for a long period of time, mainly because it was not subject to any one government's laws against collusion. So that's one point. The other point is that collusion can also be tacit. It need not be explicit. So firms don't have to physically meet in a conference room and then come out with a plan, a strategic plan. They can do things in very soft and subtle ways. For example, I'll give you a situation in which, let's say, the government or a company issues tenders for for the construction of a road. And then maybe the firms, let's say there are 4 or 5 contractors who are bidding for that particular tender. Then within them they might have an agreement, a tacit agreement, to put in high bids, high prices, right? And all that is required is a phone call from one company to another that I am bidding 400 million for this tender, you bid 420, you bid 430, you bid 440. And then they agree on which one person can sort of get the tender, that is which one contractor will issue the lowest price for the construction of the road. The price will still be high, very high, but it will be lowest among those 5. So this time that particular person will get the tender. When the next tender comes, they will ask another company within them to quote a slightly lower price, and they will get the tender. And similarly, the third and the fourth and the fifth. So after 5 tenders, they will all get 1 tender each, and they will all be happy. So this would be one example where the collusion is not as explicit as it could be in other cases. So they don't need to actually sit down physically and thrash out a collusion plan. They can do it mildly. Sometimes they don't even have to actually make phone calls. They can just get signals from how prices are moving in the market. So, for example, if there is a price leader in the market, all the oligopolistic firms will look at what the price leader is doing. If the price leader increases his price, they will take it as a signal to increase their prices also. And so they will all jack up their prices. In this case, there has been no violation of law. So this is called tacit collusion. Now we've seen that if some of those factors that we talked about, that is the size of the number of the firms, whether they are secretive about their operations, whether they produce similar products, the stability of the market, the government stance on collusion, if these different factors are favorable, a collusive oligopoly is likely to emerge. Let's now talk about the other type of oligopoly that can exist, which is a non-cooperative oligopoly, or what is called in economics as a non-collusive oligopoly. And that is when the players, when the different firms within the oligopolistic structure are not cooperating explicitly or implicitly with each other. That is, the cooperation or collusion between them breaks down or never even starts to happen. Now, why does cooperation or collusion break down or never start in a particular setup? I mean, certainly the incentive for a monopoly or for the oligopolistic firms to become a monopoly or act like a monopoly is always there. So why would it be that they would not be able to form a monopolistic position? Now the argument lies in what I talked about earlier, which is the tension between collusion and competition. On the one hand, firms do want to act like a monopoly, that is, join their hands and heads and act like one firm and maximize industry profits. But on the other hand, they want to increase their share of the pie, their share of the profits as well. And this tension sometimes causes them or tilts the balance in favor of non-collusion, or what economists call cheating. So they cheat on the agreement that has been established. So if 5 firms get together and set a price and then they allocate quotas, that is, there is a cartel, and they say that you will produce 10 units, you will produce 15, you will produce 20, then the person who has been asked to produce 10 units will have an incentive to increase his or her production to, let's say, 15 units, so that the firm can increase its profits, increase the pie of the cake. But then this will cause other firms to retaliate, and this will cause a price war. And this is what I talked about earlier, that if a price war actually breaks out, that is, if competition actually starts to happen between these oligopolistic firms, you can actually get very fierce competition, and prices sometimes fall close to the level that they would be at in perfectly competitive markets. Let's now formally see how the incentive to cheat arises in cartels which have already been formed. That is, how a collusive oligopoly can break down into a non-collusive oligopoly. Let's look at a slide. Now let us assume here that before the cartel is set up, the industry price is P1. That is, as a price taker, the firm maximizes its profits by producing at small q1, where MC is equal to P1 is equal to MR1. Its profits are shown by the rectangle P1K LAC1. Now assume that a cartel is set up and that a price is chosen to maximize industry profits. This is what cartels do. They try to behave like a monopoly so that they become the whole of the industry. This will be at P2, that is, the profit maximizing output will be where the marginal cost curve for the industry intersects the marginal revenue curve, and a price of P2 will obtain as the profit maximizing price. Total industry output must be reduced to Q2, capital Q2. Let us assume that our particular firm is allocated a quota of small q2. Now at that output, its profits will increase to the rectangle P2TSAC2, right? Which is the kind of a square type of rectangle on the top. Now note here the incentive to cheat that arises. That is, now we are trying to see how this cartel which has been formed can break down because of the incentive to cheat for our particular firm. Note that as long as the price remains fixed at P2, our firm could increase its profits even further at the expense of the other members by selling more than its assigned quota, since at Q2, small q2, price is greater than marginal cost. Therefore, our particular firm will maximize its profits at Q3, that is where marginal cost is equal to MR2. The danger, of course, is that once you start producing at Q3, the other members of the cartel will not remain silent. You would invite retaliation, a response from the other members, in that they will also try to raise their quantities, and once they all try to do it, because the industry as a whole faces a downward demand curve, the price prevailing in the market will fall significantly, and the cartel could break up in disarray. Now, I've mentioned OPEC in the past, and I've also mentioned the incentive to cheat. And it would be unfair of me if I passed this section on oligopoly without somehow trying to link the rise and fall of the OPEC with this incentive to cheat that I have just mentioned. So let's see if we can trace the rise of the OPEC in the 1970s and its ultimate fall and then its recent rise again to the incentive to cheat that each of the OPEC members had. Now, in our case study of the OPEC, let's remember what the OPEC was, how it started. The OPEC, which is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, was formed in the 1960 actually. There were 5 members to start with. There was Saudi Arabia, there was Iran, there was Iraq, there was Kuwait, and there was Venezuela. These 5 members then expanded to 13, 14, 15 members as more and more countries started to produce oil and became members of the OPEC cartel. Now, before 1973, most of these countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia had foreign companies producing oil for them, and these foreign companies used to pay royalties to the governments, and they could extract as much oil as they wished to, and they could supply it on the international market. So the price of oil was really low in the international market. It was, I think, $3 or $4 per barrel, very, very low. And the OPEC countries themselves, the governments themselves, did not have much control on how much of the oil they could supply to the world. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, things began to change. And in 1973, about that time, the control of oil production transferred from these foreign oil companies to the sovereign governments themselves. So about 1973, the OPEC countries, that is the Saudi Arabian government, the Iranian government, the Iraq, Kuwait and Venezuelan governments and the other governments which had joined in by that time, they had developed control of oil supply of their countries. And it is at this time that they decided to increase the price of oil. And they increased the price of oil by limiting the quantity of oil that they would offer to the market. And just by limiting the quantity of oil, they ensured that the price would rise, because the oil market, as you know, has a very inelastic demand curve. The people who consume oil have to consume oil whether it costs 5 rupees per barrel or 30 rupees per barrel. So the consumption of oil, the consumption side of oil was quite inelastic. And these countries, these combined together through the OPEC to raise prices. Let's trace out the history of OPEC, how the cartel rose in the 1970s, how it almost fell to pieces later on, and then how it has now again begun to rise. Let's look at a chart for this. Now, as you can see, the OPEC story begins in 1973-74, where after the Arab-Israeli war, OPEC raised the price of oil from around $3 per barrel to over $12. The price was kept at roughly this level until 1979. And yet the sales of oil did not fall significantly after 1973. And this was because, as you know, the demand for oil was inelastic. And because the demand was inelastic, the cut in supply of oil caused the price of oil to rise so much that the profits that these countries made were huge. That is, they gained in profit terms. Now, the price of oil remained around $11 to $15, $16 till the end of 1978. After 1979, the oil price rose very sharply from $15 to $40 per barrel. And this was also a result of a cut in oil supply by the OPEC. So this was the time when the OPEC was making a lot of money, a lot of profits. The problem, however, of this move was that the whole of the world economy went into recession because of this. Because of the high price of oil, the cost of production of virtually everything in the world went up. And this caused a demand response to happen. That is, people started switching from oil to other types of fuel and also reduced the quantity of oil that they consumed. Also at the same time, North Sea oil was discovered. North Sea, as you know, is the ocean which links, is the sea which links Europe to the UK. And oil was discovered there, which was then used as an alternative source of fuel by many developed countries. So this also caused a downward pressure on the price of oil in the international market. But most importantly, cheating began by some OPEC members who tried to exceed their quota limits. And this happened in the early 80s. Why did this happen? Because the market for oil was declining. Because the demand for oil had been falling, the members of OPEC were getting desperate to retain their sales. And some of them tried to exceed their quota limits. And the quota limit at that time was 16 million barrels. This was violated by some of the members, and this caused the price of oil to plummet further. So that by the early 90s, despite wars in Iraq, that is, Iraq invaded Kuwait and then the subsequent Gulf War, by the early 90s, the price of oil was back to $8 or $9 per barrel, very similar to what it was in 1973. Now, the story of OPEC doesn't end there. I mean, we saw the rise of the OPEC in the 1970s, and we saw how it declined through the 80s till the early 90s. But then there was a resurgence. And at the turn of the century, that is around 1999-2000, the price of oil hit a very high price of around $30, $35. And this meant that there was a resurgence of the cartel. And this always happens when the price of oil sinks very low. So as members become increasingly aware of their declining profits, they again have the incentive to come together and collude again. So note that the nature of collusive and non-collusive oligopolies depends on the prevailing conditions. sooner or later, when the profits of these firms, of these companies, of these countries start declining, they have an increasing incentive to collude. Then if they collude and they start doing very well, then the incentive to cheat sets in, and then the oligopoly or the collusive oligopoly breaks down. But then as they start suffering, then again they have an incentive to collude. So this is an oscillatory process. When they are making a lot of profits, they have the incentive to cheat, and that often dominates. When they are making not very many profits, then there is an incentive to collude again and increase the level of their profits. Now, because oligopolistic structures of market involve strategic behavior by firms, that is, firms take actions and then the other firms in the market respond to those actions. This is called strategic interaction. Economists make use of what is called game theoretical techniques to analyze the behavior of firms and the decisions that firms will take, taking into account the anticipated response of their rival firms. And the famous example given in this case is that of the prisoner's dilemma. I'll explain the dilemma to you, and then I'll show you how such a dilemma, not a dilemma, this situation can arise in the context of oligopolistic firms. Now think of two prisoners who have committed a crime, and they have committed the crime together, right? And they have been arrested by the police. Now both the prisoners are being interrogated separately. They are being asked questions separately. The dilemma before the prisoners is this, that if they both confess to the crime, they will both get 5 years in prison. Okay? So if they both confess and cooperate with the police, they will each get a punishment of 5 years. If they do not confess, they are both in separate rooms. If in those two rooms, both of them do not confess, then the police has no evidence to keep them, and the police will let them go for free. So their punishment will be 0. But both prisoners who are in different cells are thinking about what the other prisoner might do. And this is where the problem becomes very complicated. Now the problem is complicated because each of the prisoners does not know what the other prisoner is doing. So while one prisoner knows that if he does not confess, he can get scot-free, but that is only if the other prisoner does not confess also. What this prisoner is afraid of is that if I do not confess, but the other person confesses and says that I am also involved in the crime, that I was a partner in the crime with him, then he might get only 1 or 2 years of punishment because he has cooperated with the police, but because I have lied to the police, I might end up in jail for 10 or 12 years. And this is the same dilemma that the other prisoner is facing. He is wondering that if I do not confess, but the other prisoner confesses, then I will be in for 12 or 13 years, whereas he will only get 2 to 3 years. So when both the prisoners worry about what the other prisoner might do, and they worry about the worst case scenario that they might find themselves in, that is, each of them could be doing 12 years in prison if the other person confessed and they did not confess, then the optimal strategy for them both will be to confess. So they will both confess and they will both serve 5-year terms in prison. Note, however, that this is not the optimal, the best possible scenario that they could have achieved. The best possible scenario was if they both had not confessed. Then they both would not have had to spend even a day in prison. But because of the fear of what the other person might do, given that they have done something, they choose a strategy in which they are both worse off. This is called the prisoner's dilemma. That in choosing a strategy which they think is best or safest for themselves, they are actually both worse off. Now let's illustrate the same principle and how it applies to real-life firms in an oligopolistic structure. Now the simplest case is where there are just two firms in the industry with identical costs, products and demand. They are both considering which of two alternative prices to charge. The table here shows the payoff matrix or the profits that they will make under each of these strategies. Now let us assume that at present both firms, that is X and Y, are charging a price of 2 rupees and that they are each making a profit of rupees 10 million, giving a total industry profit of rupees 20 million. This is shown in the top left-hand box A. Now assume that they are both independently considering reducing their price to 1.8 rupees. That is independently, not together. They are not colluding. They are sitting in separate factories, separate offices, thinking of a price reduction. Now in making this decision, they will need to take into account what their rival might do and how this will affect them in turn. Let us consider X's position. In our simple example, we assume that there are just two things that its rival firm Y might do. Either Y could cut its price to 1.8 rupees or it could leave its price at rupees 2. Now given this, what should X do? One alternative is to go for the cautious or careful approach and think of the worst thing that its rival could do. If X kept its price at rupees 2, the worst thing for X would be if its rival cut its price to rupees 1.8. This is shown by box C. X's profits now fall to rupees 5 million because Y has been able to take some of the market share from X because of its lower price. If, however, X cut its price to rupees 1.8 as well, the worst outcome would again be for Y to cut its price. But this time, X's profit only falls to rupees 8 million. In this case then, if X plays cautious, it will cut its price to rupees 1.8. Note that Y will argue along similar lines, that Y will be thinking about similar issues. And if it is cautious, it too will cut its price to rupees 1.8. This policy of adopting the safer strategy is known as MaxiMin. Now this strategy of opting for the more cautious option is called a MaxiMin strategy. That is, the firm is trying to maximize the minimum profit that it will make or it can be exposed to. Let's now see what the other possible strategy is, that is the MaxiMax strategy. Let's go back to our slide. The alternative strategy, that is the MaxiMax strategy, would involve going for the optimistic approach and assuming that your rivals react in the way most favorable to you. So here the firm will go for the strategy that yields the highest possible profit. In X's case, this will again be to cut price, only this time on the optimistic assumption that firm Y will leave its price unchanged at rupees 2. If firm X is correct in its assumption, it will move to box B and achieve the maximum possible profit of rupees 12 million. This strategy of going for the maximum possible profit is known as MaxiMax, as I said earlier. Note that again the same argument applies to Y. Its MaxiMax strategy will also be to cut the price to rupees 1.8 and hopefully end up in box C. Given that in this game, both approaches MaxiMin and MaxiMax lead to the same strategy, namely cutting the price to 1.8 rupees, we call this type of game as a dominant strategy game. But given that both X and Y will be tempted to lower prices, they will both end up earning a lower profit, that is rupees 8 million profit each, and they will both land in box D. Note that if they had charged the higher price and both of them had agreed on this higher price, and this would be the case of a collusive oligopoly or a cartel, they would have both made rupees 10 million in box A. Thus, collusion rather than a price war would have benefited both, and yet both would be tempted to cheat and cut prices. Note that in this example, like the example of the prisoner's dilemma that I gave you, both firms would have been better off if they had cooperated or colluded with each other and charged the higher price. Yet we saw that both firms' dominant strategy was to cheat, that is to charge the lower price, and that led to a reduction in the profits of both firms. Now, analysis like this, through the game theoretic approach, is useful because, one, it does not rely on the firm knowing exactly what the other firm might do. You can get an idea of what a particular firm's dominant strategy will be just based on the different types of menus of options that the other firm might respond with. However, what is needed in order to make a payoff matrix and then to decide what option or what strategy a particular firm will choose, you need to assign values to the response that the other firm will give. So you need to know what will be the payoff if the other firm responds in this manner, what will be the payoff if the other firm responds in another manner. And that is often not possible to come up with in real-world situations. Also, the example that I just showed you was a case in which a dominant strategy did emerge. That is, we did have one dominant strategy for the firm, whether it followed the MaxiMax approach or the MaxiMin approach. This is often not the case in more complex games where there is no single dominant strategy. So basically, my friends, that concludes our lecture for today. We've talked about oligopolies. We've talked about the tension that oligopolists face between competition on the one hand and collusion on the other. We analyzed the factors which make the emergence of a collusive oligopoly or a cartel more likely. We saw the case of the OPEC, and we saw how it rose and then it fell and then it rose again. And we saw that these things were quite common with cartels because when they were making a lot of profits, the incentive to cheat was higher. But when they were making not so nice profits, then the incentive to collude became higher. So the oscillatory nature of cartel formation and cartel breakdown was a feature of oligopolistic market structures. We also saw that in the case of non-collusive oligopolies, game theoretical approaches could be used to set up payoff matrices and analyze what a particular firm's dominant strategy would be, given an idea of what the payoff would be if the rival firm operated or made a decision in a certain way. However, we also saw that there were limitations to the game theoretic approach and that it could not be applied universally, especially when there was not any single dominant strategy. That is, if the MaxiMax or MaxiMin approaches strategies gave you different optimum strategies. Now, in tomorrow's lecture or in our next lecture, we will talk about oligopolies and the public interest. We can never forget the public interest. When we discuss monopolies, we discuss the implications for public interest. Similarly, for monopolistic competition and for perfect competition. And so oligopolies are no different. So we will see whether oligopolies serve the public interest better or whether they are harmful for public interest. So my friends, this brings us to the end of today's lecture. The last two lectures in microeconomics, and yes, the next two lectures will be the last two lectures in microeconomics, will be focused on a number of issues. We will not be discussing one topic in detail. We will be talking about aspects of different topics. And we will be talking about the issue of marginal social costs. We will talk about the market for factors of production. And we will also talk about information economics. As you know, we are living in the information age. So it's important to know how economics is affected by information products. So I hope that you're looking forward to all this exciting material in the next two lectures. And then once you've assimilated all of this, we'll be in a position to move to a study of macroeconomics. So till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.